I always found the old cabin in the woods behind my neighbor's property unsettling. It was a relic of another time, hidden among dense trees, its wooden beams weathered and warped. My neighbor, Mr. Grayson, was an odd man, quiet, reclusive, the kind of guy you'd see only when he was collecting mail or working in his overgrown garden. People in the neighborhood whispered about him, saying he had a past he didn't talk about. Some claimed he'd inherited the cabin from his great-grandfather, who had disappeared under strange circumstances. I didn't think much of it until one October evening when Mr. Grayson showed up on my doorstep. It was out of character for him. He rarely interacted with anyone. He stood there, his face pale and drawn, his thin frame wrapped in a tattered coat. "I need your help," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's about the cabin." I blinked, caught off guard. "What about it?" "There's something wrong, something I can't handle alone. Please, just come take a look." I hesitated. There was something in his eyes, a deep primal fear that made my stomach twist. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and followed him. The walk through the woods was silent except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of damp earth. When we reached the cabin, I was struck by how decrepit it looked up close. The roof sagged, the windows were shattered, and the door hung askew on its hinges. But what struck me the most was the aura of the place. It felt wrong, like the trees themselves leaned away from it, and the shadows around it were darker, thicker than they should be. "What's going on?" I asked, my breath visible in the cold air. Mr. Grayson swallowed hard. "I don't know how to explain it, but I've been hearing things, voices, and last night I saw something inside." A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. "Probably just animals. This place looks like it's been abandoned for decades." He shook his head. "It's not animals." He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside was worse than I'd imagined. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and the air was thick with a smell I couldn't quite place, something metallic and sour. The walls were lined with old shelves, their contents long since rotted or rusted. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden trapdoor, its edges worn smooth as if it had been opened and closed countless times. "I think it's coming from down there," Mr. Grayson said, his voice trembling as he pointed to the trapdoor. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight on it. The wood was darkened with age, and deep gouges marred its surface, as if something had clawed at it from below. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay. "Have you opened it?" I asked. He nodded. "Once, and I heard something moving." I stared at him, trying to gauge if he was serious, but the fear in his eyes was genuine, and it made me shiver. "Fine," I said, swallowing my own fear. "Let's open it together." We grabbed the rusted iron handle and pulled. The trapdoor resisted at first, as if something on the other side was holding it shut, but then it gave way with a loud creak, revealing a set of narrow stone steps leading down into darkness. A foul odor wafted up, stronger than before, making my stomach churn. We stood there for a moment, neither of us willing to take the first step. Finally, I clicked on my flashlight and started down, Mr. Grayson following close behind. The air grew colder with each step, the light from the cabin fading until it was just us and the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into a large circular chamber. The walls were made of rough stone, and strange symbols were carved into them, their shapes twisting and jagged. In the center of the room was a circle of blackened candles, their wax melted onto the floor. And in the middle of the circle lay something that made my blood run cold. It was a bundle of cloth, old and tattered, and it was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if something inside was breathing. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Mr. Grayson replied, his voice barely audible. "I didn't get this far last time." I inched closer, the beam of my flashlight steady on the bundle. As I reached out to touch it, a sound echoed through the chamber, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bundle twitched violently, and then it began to unravel. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight as the cloth fell away to reveal what was inside. At first I thought it was a child, a small, frail figure curled in the fetal position. But then it moved, unfolding its limbs with an unnatural grace, and I realized it wasn't human. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes black and hollow. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a laugh. "Run," Mr. Grayson whispered, but I was frozen in place. The creature turned its head toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stared at me for a moment, and then it smiled, a horrible, twisted grin that made my stomach churn, and then it lunged. I don't remember much of what happened next. I ran, stumbling up the stairs with Mr. Grayson right behind me. The creature's screams echoed through the cabin as we burst out into the night. We didn't stop running until we were back at my house, slamming the door shut behind us. For a long time, we sat there in silence, catching our breath. Finally, Mr. Grayson spoke. "It won't stop," he said, his voice hollow. "I've tried everything. It always comes back." I looked at him, my blood running cold. "What do you mean?" He met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of his fear. "That thing, it's part of the cabin, part of this land. You can't get rid of it. All you can do is keep it locked away." I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning, Mr. Grayson was gone. His house was empty, the curtains drawn, and the cabin in the woods stood silent and foreboding. I tried to forget about what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every night, I heard noises coming from the woods, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, and every morning I found claw marks on my back door, deep and fresh. And then one night, I woke to the sound of creaking wood. My heart stopped as I realized it was coming from inside the house, from the basement. And the last thing I heard before the light went out was that guttural, twisted laugh. It had been years since I'd been to my grandparents' old cabin. They used to take me there every summer when I was a kid, but after they passed away, the place sat empty, collecting dust and memories. When my friends suggested a weekend getaway to escape the chaos of college life, I thought of the cabin. It was remote, quiet, and surrounded by dense woods, a perfect place to unwind. Tom, Sarah, Jamie, and I packed up my old SUV and hit the road on a crisp Friday morning. The drive took hours, winding through narrow, tree-lined roads until we finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked exactly as I remembered, a small, weathered structure with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "Quaint," Tom said, grinning as he hoisted his backpack. "You weren't kidding about it being in the middle of nowhere." "That's the charm," I replied, trying to ignore the slight unease that crept over me. The cabin had always felt safe as a child, but now it seemed different, older, darker. Inside, the cabin was musty, the air heavy with the scent of aged wood and mildew. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs clung to the corners. The main room had a stone fireplace, a worn-out sofa, and a small kitchen. 2 bedrooms were tucked away down the hall, and a rickety staircase led up to the attic. "We'll have this place feeling cozy in no time," Sarah said, already sweeping away cobwebs. Jamie set about starting a fire, and Tom rummaged through the kitchen cabinets, finding an ancient stash of canned goods and laughing at the expired labels. As the sun set, the cabin took on a warmer atmosphere. The fire crackled, and we settled in with snacks and a deck of cards. For a while, it was perfect, just us, the firelight, and the sound of the woods outside. But as the hours passed, the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the cabin grew colder despite the roaring fire. By midnight, we were all ready to call it a night. Sarah and I took one bedroom, while Tom and Jamie claimed the other. The old beds creaked under our weight, and the thin walls made it easy to hear the others talking and laughing as they settled in. It didn't take long for the exhaustion of the day to catch up with me. I drifted off, the sound of the wind in the trees lulling me to sleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Jamie or Tom, but as I lay there, I realized the sound was coming from above us. Slow, deliberate steps creaked across the attic floor, moving back and forth as if someone or something was pacing. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered beside me, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart pounding. "It's probably just the wind," I lied, though I knew better. The footsteps were too steady, too purposeful to be the wind. The pacing continued for what felt like hours, and then it stopped, right above our room. I held my breath, straining to hear. The silence was deafening, pressing in around us. And then came the knock. 3 loud, deliberate knocks, right above our heads. Sarah clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to get the others," she whispered. I nodded, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could. We tiptoed into the hallway and knocked on the boys' door. Tom opened it, his face pale. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. We all stood in the hallway, staring at the attic door at the end. The narrow staircase leading up to it was bathed in shadows, the kind that seemed to move and shift when you weren't looking directly at them. "Maybe it's an animal," Jamie suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Only one way to find out," Tom said, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen. He led the way, his bravado clearly masking his fear. The rest of us followed, huddled together as we climbed the creaking staircase. The attic door was closed, but as we reached the top, it creaked open on its own, revealing the dark space beyond. Tom shone his flashlight inside, the beam cutting through the dust-filled air. The attic was empty. We stepped inside, our breaths fogging in the cold air. Old furniture and boxes were piled haphazardly, draped in yellowed sheets. The wooden floor was warped, the planks uneven, but there was no sign of anything, or anyone, that could have made the footsteps. "See? Nothing," Tom said, though his voice was tight. He swung the flashlight around one last time before turning to leave, and that's when we heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Stay?" The voice was low and guttural, like the scrape of metal on stone. We froze, staring at each other, and then the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the attic into darkness. Panic set in. Tom's flashlight flickered and died, leaving us in total blackness. I fumbled for my phone, but when I turned on the flashlight, it only illuminated the face of something that shouldn't have been there. It was crouched in the corner, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like points. The skin stretched over its bones was pale and translucent, and its mouth twisted into a grin that revealed jagged teeth. It moved toward us, its joints cracking with every step. "Run!" Jamie shouted, shoving the door open. We bolted down the stairs, the thing's laughter echoing behind us. The cabin seemed alive, the walls groaning and the floorboards shifting beneath our feet. We burst into the main room, but the front door wouldn't budge. The windows were covered in a thick, black substance that oozed and writhed like it was alive. The air grew colder, and the laughter grew louder, coming from all around us. "What do we do?" Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. Tom grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window, but it was no use. The black substance absorbed the impact, spreading further up the glass. The attic door creaked open again, and the thing descended the stairs, its twisted body jerking with every movement. It spoke again, its voice echoing through the cabin. "You came to my home, and now you'll stay." The lights flickered, and then they went out entirely. In the pitch black, I felt something cold and wet wrap around my ankle, pulling me down. I screamed, clawing at the floor, but it was no use. The last thing I heard was the sound of my friends, screams mixing with that horrible laughter, and then everything went silent. The next morning, the cabin was empty. The police found our car parked at the edge of the woods, but there was no sign of us. They said the cabin had been abandoned for decades, that no one had lived there since my grandparents disappeared all those years ago. But sometimes, on cold, quiet nights, people walking through the woods say they hear footsteps coming from the attic and voices whispering from the shadows, calling them to come inside. When my grandparents passed away, I inherited their old cabin in the woods. It had been years since I'd visited, but I remembered it as a cozy retreat, warm, inviting, filled with the smell of my grandmother's cooking and the sound of my grandfather's laughter. Those memories were a far cry from the reality I encountered when I returned to clean the place up. The cabin was in disrepair, its once vibrant wooden exterior now faded and splintered. Vines crawled up the sides, and the porch sagged under my weight as I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and every surface seemed coated in a fine layer of neglect. Still, I felt a strange pull to stay, as if the cabin itself were urging me to restore it. I spent the first day scrubbing down the kitchen, airing out the musty living room, and sweeping away cobwebs. It was exhausting but satisfying work. The cabin was beginning to feel like it could be livable again. On the second day, I started on the bedrooms. My grandparents' room was exactly as they'd left it, the bed neatly made, my grandfather's glasses still sitting on the nightstand. I felt a pang of sadness as I packed away their belongings, but it was comforting too, like they were still here in some small way. It wasn't until I was cleaning out the closet that I found the key. It was hidden inside a small wooden box tucked away on the top shelf. The key was old and ornate, its brass surface tarnished with age. Attached to it was a yellowed piece of paper with a single word scrawled in my grandfather's shaky handwriting: basement. I frowned. I didn't remember the cabin having a basement. Curious, I searched the house, eventually finding a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug in the corner of the living room. The edges of the trapdoor were darkened with age, and the iron handle was cool to the touch. My hand trembled as I inserted the key. The lock clicked open with a satisfying snap, and I hesitated, my heart pounding. Something about this felt wrong. The air around the trapdoor was colder, the faint smell of mildew drifting up from the edges. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a steep wooden staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. I grabbed my flashlight and started down, each step creaking ominously beneath my weight. The basement was larger than I expected, its walls made of rough stone. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp, and the space was filled with an assortment of old furniture, trunks, and crates. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to vibrate through the air, setting me on edge. As I moved deeper into the basement, my flashlight beam caught something unusual. Carved into the stone walls were strange symbols, their jagged lines twisting in unnatural patterns. I ran my fingers over one of them, feeling the grooves beneath my fingertips. They were deep, almost as if someone, or something, had clawed them into the stone. At the far end of the basement, I found an old wooden chest. It was massive, its surface scarred and stained. A heavy chain wrapped around it, secured with a rusted padlock. My first instinct was to leave it alone, but the same curiosity that had driven me to open the trapdoor urged me forward. I searched the basement until I found a crowbar, then returned to the chest. The padlock gave way with a loud crack, and I pried the lid open. Inside was a pile of old, moth-eaten fabric. I reached out to move it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the cloth, I recoiled. It was damp and cold, and the faint smell of decay grew stronger. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the fabric aside and froze. Beneath the cloth were bones, human bones, a rib cage, a skull, long, thin femurs. The skull's empty eye socket seemed to stare up at me, and its jaw was open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand. It hit the ground and rolled, casting wild shadows across the walls. As I scrambled to pick it up, I heard it, the sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. Someone or something was in the cabin. My breath hitched and I held still, listening as the footsteps moved across the floorboards. They stopped directly above the open trapdoor, and then the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic surged through me. I scrambled up the stairs, pounding on the trapdoor, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps continued above me, circling the room. I shouted, but the sound seemed swallowed by the oppressive air. Suddenly, the humming in the basement grew louder, vibrating through the walls. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow faintly, their twisted lines pulsing with a sickly green light. I backed away from the trapdoor, my heart racing. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the basement seemed to deepen, coalescing into a single shape at the far end of the room. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was a featureless void, and its presence radiated a bone-chilling dread. As it moved toward me, the symbols on the walls flared brighter, casting eerie, flickering light across the space. "Why are you here?" a voice echoed, deep and distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing, my body frozen in terror. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "It's not meant to be disturbed." The figure reached out a hand, if you could call it that, long fingers stretching toward me. I turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven floor, my flashlight barely illuminating the way. Behind me, the figure's footsteps echoed, growing faster, closer. I reached the base of the stairs and threw myself at the trapdoor. With a desperate burst of strength, I pushed, and it flew open. I scrambled out, slamming it shut behind me and locking it with the old key. The cabin was deathly silent, the footsteps gone. I backed away from the trapdoor, my chest heaving. For a moment, I thought I was safe, and then I heard it. A faint scratching, coming from beneath the floorboards. Slow, deliberate, insistent. I stared at the trapdoor, the key still in my hand, and realized the terrible truth. Whatever I'd disturbed in the basement wasn't trapped anymore. It was coming for me.